Hello, everyone. This is Eric Pennington with the Spirit of EQ, and welcome to the Spirit of EQ podcast.
Life is a journey. Spirit of EQ helps shape and guide the road ahead for individuals, leaders, teams, and organizations striving to realize their full potential through emotional intelligence. Spirit of EQ is a coaching and consulting company that assists individuals and businesses to reach their full potential by developing emotional intelligence. In business, managers and leaders recognize the value of training to develop leadership skills. What they may not realize is that those skills are far more effective when they pay attention to not only performance, but also to people. Emotional intelligence is a crucial skill because people drive performance and emotions drive people.
Today we have a very special guest, Toya Spencer. And not joining me this week is my partner in crime, Jeff East. He is out ill, but we wish him well. Toya Spencer, it's so great to see you.
Thank you.
You know, a lot of times as a host, we get into these rhythms of what we typically say. Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I've been wanting to have you on the show. Those of you in the audience, I have been wanting Toya to be on this show for probably the last 3 months. And she probably doesn't know that at all that depth, but I'm gonna kind of give it to you as to why. We had a conversation, it's probably been 3 or 4 months ago, and there were some things that she said to me around diversity and inclusion that just have stuck in my brain. And when that happens for me, that's that motivation to go, I need to get him on the show. I need to get him on the show. Now, I didn't know you super well then, so it wasn't like I could just say, hey, Toya, we're recording the next week. Can you make it? So I'm kind of going slowly. And you were gracious enough to agree to be on. So I am very excited for what we're going to talk about today. So, Toya, Director of Diversity and Inclusion, but your background is so much broader than just that title. Can you tell the audience a little bit about your background and how that's played? Because you've been in this space for a bit, right?
Yes. So I've been in this space for probably about 16 years. I started doing diversity, equity, inclusion work at a pretty interesting company, Abercrombie Fitch. And
heard of them.
And when people hear that brand, there's a lot of things that come to mind, right? When you hear about that brand, probably one that's not the most inclusive or the most diverse. Back then, I would say they've made a lot of strides in the last couple of years. But I started my career there straight out of graduate school. Initially started on the product side of the business. So I have kind of like two careers at A&F. So the first side, about 8 years on the product side, did some really cool things, product development, had a chance to, travel all over the world with our manufacturers and vendors and all that great stuff. And then we had that lawsuit.
Yes, I remember that.
$50 million lawsuit whereby it was a class action lawsuit, and the organization agreed and said, there's some things that we probably need to do better.
Okay.
And so they hired at that time a vice president of diversity and inclusion, and he joined the organization. I met him, and he asked me to be a part of his team. So I was kind of his first person on the team, and worked right alongside of him in doing this sort of transformative organizational change work around diversity, equity, inclusion at A&F.
Wow. And I butchered the acronym. I find myself saying DEI, and then I remember we used to call it diversity and inclusion. So I apologize about that. One thing that's very intriguing to me, you think of these large organizations like an Abercrombie, and you think change. It's like, oh my gosh, how do you move that giant ship, right? Because I would imagine that lawsuit kind of was, we want change now type thing.
Yes. So as that organization came to have an initiative by force, if you will, external sort of measures, right?
Right.
Other organizations come to it where they naturally say, wow, this is something that we need to do. Let's make some changes in the organization. So because we were in that situation, there were outlines, I can't, the actual name is escaping me, but every 6 months we had to report into a judge everything that we were doing around diversity, equity, inclusion, from a recruiting standpoint, from a hiring standpoint, from where are we advertising and what magazines, all of, the detail.
And this was this part of the settlement?
Yes, this was part of the settlement, right? And so in that environment, it felt a little bit more, you could say you're forced to do some things. Right. So you're balancing things that you're forced to do with trying to create authentic change with people.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be challenging because you have some folks who are like, wow, this is great. We should be doing this. And then you have others who are like, okay, how much longer do we have to do this? And how quickly can we get through it? And it was a 7-year consent decree. So we're not talking a couple of months, And so the great thing is when you look at organizational change and when you start to see evidence of that and those things that whatever you're trying to do take root, you start seeing those changes at the 5-year mark. So we were fortunate that all of those things that we were doing, even though we were doing them because we had to do them, there was change that was really starting to take root in attitudes and behaviors and, common language that was being established and people really beginning to see a shift in the organization.
That's so interesting to me. And I'm going to course correct because I'm going to come back to some of that. But let me let you finish talking about your background. So you were in Abercrombie. You were in the midst of this, obviously, a lot of change. What was next? Tell us more of that.
Sure. So spent about a 16-year span of time at A&F. So again, all of that was not in DEI.
Okay.
Actually, it was called diversity and inclusion at the time. The equity piece didn't come along until later. We
later.
can talk about that too.
Yeah.
But left Abercrombie and Fitch and then went on to Huntington Bank.
I'm very familiar.
Corporate headquarters downtown Columbus. And that was in part because I had some family changes. I became a mom and wanted to have a little bit more stability in terms of being at home and not having to travel internationally so much.
Right.
So that was perfect. So you are in, a bank. We have had a footprint of about 6 states. So it kept me local.
Yep.
And it kept me challenged in that I was in a different field. So,
retail to banking,
oh my gosh,
right?
Retail to banking, those corporate environments couldn't be any farther apart. I mean,
I bet.
Suiting up every day and coming from wearing jeans and flip-flops, and Chuck Taylors,
right?
Big difference.
Yeah.
And then after Huntington Bank, I went to a global life and sciences technology company called Danaher. And spent some time there doing some global work again. So got back in that space. I think I was kind of missing the global impact and responsibility.
Wow.
And made a decision to go back. And then it was a little short-lived because the demands of that job.
And you were well into being a mom at that point,
Yeah, I was
too,
well
right?
into being a mom.
Yeah.
And, and this is interesting because it's okay. Sometimes you think you're ready to go back to a space and you get there. And for me, life sort of taught me a lesson about what was really important for me, right? And so I made a decision at that point, one of the best and scariest decisions to walk away from corporate and take about a 3.5-year hiatus from corporate work to be a mom and to sort of figure out what was my next step and what was going to be purpose work for me.
Wow. That's, you happen to be on a show about emotional intelligence, Toya. You're like a walking advertisement of that, the power of decision making. That's awesome. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and I know I butchered the acronym in the beginning, and then you just mentioned again how we added equity into the. So if somebody listening now would say, okay, so how are you defining it? What is DEI? What does it mean to, and maybe not so much to the person that's in that world. Maybe you're in an organization where they're hearing it a lot more these days. If not, it's like now there are programs. So talk about your vision around that.
So for me, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and again, I mentioned sort of the evolution of it. And I think we've seen, so diversity in my mind is this broad term of all of the things that make us different. Right. That define who we are on the inside and on the outside. So it's this combination of things that you see about a person, those things you don't see about a person. Okay. And when we talk about that in North America, in the United States, it's generally focused on a couple of things. It's race, gender, sexual orientation, maybe religion, maybe immigrant status. But I have always been a student of a model that I've used in my work that was created by Gardner, Schwartz, and Rowe, two professors, and they propose that there are 24 dimensions of diversity. There's 4 layers of diversity. And so you have at the center of that is your personality. You get to the internal dimensions, which are things like race, gender, sexual orientation, ability. Then you move out into external dimensions, which are like geographic locations. And then we go into organizational dimensions, like where you are in the organization, your tenure, content, work. So that is diversity. I like to use that definition because I think we tend to get stuck on a couple of things. Right? And when you start looking at the broadness of how diversity can be defined, I think it might cause some paradigm shift in terms of how you talk about diversity. Okay, gotcha. Inclusion is just, what do you do with that diversity? It's not just enough to say, oh, we hired all of these people, or we have this, and this. You can tick it off. But how does it feel when those people come to work every single day? Are they seen? Are they valued? Or do they feel like they're just, they're checking that box of that aspect of diversity that you need? And then the equity piece is creating a space where people not only equally are involved, right? But they're involved in such a way where you're taking into consideration their situation or their circumstance. So the way that plays out for me, for example, in education, we say, okay, we want to provide equal access to all students. But in doing so, equity says, I need to be mindful of where that student is coming from or their experience and their background and give that student what they need to be successful in the classroom. It may not be exactly the same for all students. So in my mind, equity takes us one step past equality, saying, hey, I do this for everybody. But what you do for everybody may not necessarily be enough to get that person to a level of where they're successful and being able to climb over the fence like the next person.
Wow, that's great. That's great, Toya. And for those of you in the audience, and I don't know if I leaped over it in the beginning, you've moved into the education space now, right?
Yes, I have.
Which I think is really, really powerful. And so much, though the work that we do at Spirit of EQ is not targeted toward students, we obviously can see the importance, because if they can begin to embrace that, I mean, the way you described it there, Toya, confirms for me once again why I wanted you on the show, because that one, to me, the way you described it, I would have to say that 90% of the people would go, well, of course, yeah, that's what we should do, right? And keep in mind, I realize some people deal with their old neural pathways where maybe they looked at it as equality and equity is a new thing, and they're still trying to figure out, well, how do I navigate that? Sure. And I get it. There's probably a percentage out there that says, I don't want to have anything to do with this. You can listen to a different show. That's okay. We're going to talk about the path forward, and I think that that's where that plays into. So, Toya, one of our early conversations around this idea about racist, anti-racist, and you said some things that said that that's not a really good place to start if you're really wanting true change. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic?
Sure. So I will start by saying that I believe in the principles of anti-racism, meaning that I want to live in a society, want to work in an organization, be in a school district that is devoid of racism. Okay.
Yes, right.
So absolutely.
Yeah.
However, for me, part of the language that we hear in anti-racism conversation, I will be honest, for me as a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional, is not language that I'm familiar with, nor language that I have ever embraced in all of my work in this space. So, in many ways, I think for me, I am kind of familiarizing myself with this new environment that we're in and having this conversation.
Yep.
It's a necessary conversation, but for me, I'm not sure that is the way forward for us in Worthington Schools, where I am right now.
Yeah.
I think it's an incomplete conversation.
That's
Maybe that's a better way to say it.
Yeah.
Because when we look at again, I'll go back to my definition of diversity. When we look at the broadness of diversity, race is one component of that. And so what I feel is that the conversation on anti-racism is an incomplete conversation, because when I think about my work as a DEI leader, I'm thinking of all aspects of diversity.
Yeah.
So my students and my community members that are LGBTQ, where do they fit in the conversation of anti-racism? Or my students that have disabilities, or families with children that have disabilities, where do they fit in that conversation?
Yeah.
So it is, from my vantage point, a part of a larger conversation, which that larger conversation for me is diversity, equity, inclusion. Yeah. How am I creating inclusion around all of these aspects of diversity? How am I creating an equitable environment around all of those aspects of diversity, of which race is a part of it?
That's really, really good. That's really good. That gives me a lot of clarity, because I think sometimes, and I have very strong opinions about our media and how it kind of manipulates conversation to suit the needs of I would say, the organization, whether it's ratings, earnings, or what have you. Because as an African-American male, I feel kind of limited when the conversation is only around the pigment color of my skin. It is a part. There's no getting around it. But there's also another part of me that goes, well, wait a minute. I know I don't particularly like that. I particularly like this. And some of that can be very deeply held by me. And if it's not addressed, and I think I'm not alone here, Toya, if you dismiss or leave without making room for those other things, it gives you a sense of, well, I guess that doesn't matter to them.
Yeah.
And I think that, though I know it's almost near to impossible to take each individual's uniqueness and make sure that every part of that uniqueness is addressed.
Sure.
But what I like about what you were describing is that there is this overarching motivation to do that, right?
Sure.
To respect it. And again, here's the great one. And our producer Brett knows I talk about Miles Davis a lot on these shows.
I like Miles Davis. Yes.
Right? Oh, I'm glad I have someone in my tribe.
Yes.
So there's something about his music, there's something about his artistry, the way that he approached it, that speaks to me. But there's some people, Toya, that go, I don't get it.
Yeah.
Sure. My wife would be one of those. It's like she'll go, okay, that was nice.
Yeah.
I think, right? But each of us, I think we want to feel that there's more to us than just something that is manifested physically, right? So I love that idea. I'm going to take you back in time, and you weren't there, but this is for me a story from my background.
Okay.
Many, many, many years ago, long a time ago, far, far away galaxy, I used to be in the corporate world, and in this organization, Fortune 500 company, and we were in a division of many divisions within the organization, and this was probably in the early mid 2000s, right? And some of this stuff was starting to bubble up. How do we act more on purpose about, in this case, it was recruiting, right? To have a more diverse workforce. I think that's kind of how it was couched. And I remember having a conversation with a human resources professional, and I said, well, I'm a person, I kind of like, I want to do something. I don't want to have another meeting to talk about what we could do. And I'd brought up, well, why don't you go to the colleges and find out what organizations within that are housed and have particular groups of people who are what you're targeting, and just say, hey, we can't guarantee everybody a job. We're not saying that just because of that you get this, but we're interested in you. And we want you. When we have positions, we want you to apply. And I remember it was like a room of crickets. And I thought, well, that's easily done. I mean, it's just you call the university and say, hey, look, I'm with, and again, Fortune 500. Yes. So it wasn't Bill's Auto Repair in Lancaster or something, right? It was a large organization, had a very big brand.
Yes.
And I always wondered, well, why wouldn't they act on that?
Yeah.
So what do you think are some of the blocks? Because I know that there's well-intentioned on the lips.
Yes.
But what really moves it, is it not the well-intentioned and the heart? I'm kind of making a play on the words there, but what do you think are some of the reasons why we wouldn't do certain things to improve?
Yeah.
And I know that could be a long list.
Sure.
But
well, so, in light of everything that I feel like transpired last year, right? All of the social unrest, the racial unrest.
Yep.
We had a lot of organizations that were making statements, were, putting a black box up to, show support of the African American community.
Yep.
And I was one of those people that was watching those companies, right? I was watching to see, one, what's the first step, right? Are you making a statement? I was evaluating the content of the statement for the sincerity, the honesty, and the accountability and the actions that we're going to follow, right?
Yep.
And so I think for me, it's an organization that would acknowledge, you know what, we haven't done really well in this space, right? For whatever the reasons. I mean, let's just be real. Many companies don't do this well, right? And so you wouldn't be the only company out there that says we have not done a great space of recruiting for diverse talent, for people of color, for any other aspect of diversity, whatever that may be.
Right.
We haven't done a great job at that. Great. You're in great company because there are a lot of companies out there that haven't. Okay?
Right. Yeah.
But it's then saying, what are we going to do about it? Right. You have that level of honesty, and then you say, we're going to put a plan in place. One of the things that I always think about, and I encourage an organization, after you've made the statement, okay, it comes from your lips and saying this is something we want to do. The next thing I think about is, are you really ready? Right? Is the organization really ready to say we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to do the difficult, the long work of making change in this space? So I think it's a great idea to go through a process by which you're saying, realistically, as an organization, are we ready to undertake such an effort? Because you're going to look at things like, is our leadership on board? Right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So we're saying that, but do we have leadership commitment? Leaders that are committed in words and in action. Are they going to make bold decisions? Are they going to shake things up, take risks? Right?
Yeah,
because you're going to have to do some things differently to get different results.
Yep.
Do we have things in place in the organization? Do I have, if say we're going to, one of the staples of any DEI strategy is training. It's a part of it, not the only thing that makes the difference, right? But it's a part of it. Do I have training in place? Do I have the structure to support a organizational wide rollout of training around diversity, equity, inclusion, around implicit bias, around microaggressions? Do I have that in place?
Yep.
Can I support that?
Yep.
Do I have the financial resources allocated to have a sustainable initiative? Do I have a person that is a person or people who are going to be identified, who are going to lead this?
Yeah.
Because if you really want to have a change process, you got to have somebody that they're focused on this, right? And the support. So you can't just hire a person and go, okay, you run with it, you go do it. They have no support, they have no resources, they have no budget, they have nothing.
And I'm going to take you back to your statement about Abercrombie, that was a 5-year deal to get to kind of breakthrough, right?
7, yes, 7 years.
Okay.
It was a 7-year consent decree, right?
Okay. So there's an acknowledgement that this is not happening tomorrow.
Exactly. It doesn't happen overnight, right?
Yeah.
And so are you embedding your initiative in the organization? Is it connected to objectives and goals? Is it part of the business strategy, right? Is it sustainable, or is it just a flavor of the day?
Yes. And Toya, I go back a bit last year, and I was on it was a Zoom call, and it was this was just after what happened with George Floyd in Minneapolis. And obviously, I've lived in not obviously, but I've lived in the United States virtually all my life, right? So I've heard and I've seen a lot, right? I'm only 12, but
12 plus.
12 plus. But the reality is that I've heard a lot of this before.
Yes.
And I remember on this call, and I said,
Yes.
I just got to say this, guys. I said, sometimes, and I don't know if I used the term white America, but it was something to that effect. I said, you guys remind me of like Christmas time. I said, around late November, I start hearing Jingle Bells and Silent Night. And in my head, in my brain, I go, oh my gosh, we're getting close to Christmas time. It's pretty soon we're going to see the trees, the decorations, and the lights, and all that. And then sometime between December 25th and December 31st, I don't hear like Silent Night. Most lights are down. And then when January comes, it's like we go back to what we did before. And I remember saying, I'm not trying to pour water on sincere desire for change, but you got to remember something. Some of us have been watching and quite frankly are a little skeptical that you have it in you to actually do something with it. That has led me to it leads me to thinking about a conversation we had about systemic racism. And one of the things, and full disclosure, I've been a little worn out by all the media coverage because it's like, that's, you turn it on, that's what you hear. You hear it. And I hear it, systematic racism, and it was kind of like, okay, whatever. Okay, I'm sure. Intellectually, I always known that exists. But here's what's funny. And you may remember where I went with this, is that it was about 2 a.m, and I'm one of these weird people, ladies and gentlemen, out there in the audience land, that I sometimes need to hear radio background noise to help me sleep. So I happen to have on Colin Cowherd, who actually I do enjoy his program. I do enjoy him as a radio personality. And he had on there LeVar Arrington, former NFL linebacker, all-pro type guy. And you owe it to yourself to listen to him because he's a really smart guy and he's got some interesting insights. So for some reason I wake up and I hear them talking, and they're talking about the NFL coaching tree. And most everyone has heard of, there's the Bill Walsh coaching tree. There's the Andy Reid coaching tree. And especially there's the Bill Belichick coaching tree. And Arrington had it was a poetic way of, and he didn't, and Toya, you remember me saying this, he didn't come out and say systematic racism. It was this poetic way of saying, well, if you worked with Andy Reid 15 years ago, who happened to also work with Bill Belichick, who happened to also work with, and then when they were putting together a new team, or when somebody got fired and went to a new team, they call you up and say, hey, I'd like you to come on. That works out real great for you. But I guess if you're not in that circle and you're like, hey, I'm really good at this too, and I'd like to be a part of this, and you might find yourself on the outside looking in.
Yes.
And he said it much better than I just did. But by that time, 2:30 in the morning, I'm going, I felt it was a God thing.
Yes.
It was as if God said, so what do you think about systematic racism now, Eric?
Yeah.
And I go, he just described it. And I remember coming to you and saying, okay, Toya, maybe I've got this all wrong with the definition. Maybe this is not, but it sounds like this is systematic racism.
Yeah.
And to be fair to all those coaches in the coaching, they may not be necessarily evil, mean, overtly, I want to do bad things to anyone who doesn't look like me, talk like me or whatever, but it still exists.
Yes.
So can we talk just a little bit about that? And is that kind of what systematic racism is?
So essentially, yes, you're right? That's a great example of it. It is when people are operating in a system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm the kind of person where I like to go back to the root. Let's go back to the history, because I think when you do that, you understand, and it gives you a greater perspective and understanding of where we are right now.
Yeah.
So if you look at where college, where NFL football was, who were the, first players, who created it, you look at what did those people look like? They were all white males.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Yep.
They were all white males.
Yep.
Now, they were creating a system that was for them, right? With them in mind.
Right.
So it's not saying that those people purposely, right? When you look at systemic things, when you look at institutionally when they were created, there's not a natural assumption that it was always created to keep people out, right?
Right.
What happens is sometimes people who are amongst themselves, that's all they know in their circle, they're going to create something that benefits people who look like them, right? If their circle is not inclusive of other people, then those that are around you, you're like, oh, yeah, well, this works. Yeah, we do this. We think alike. We do this alike, right? And so you end up with a system that is benefiting people who think like you, look like you, come from the same network as you. And no one has ever given any thought that this could be exclusive to somebody else who may not be a part of that. So what happens is people play out in that system. They just keep navigating in that system.
Yeah.
It's benefiting you if you're part of that system.
Right.
But if you're on the outside looking in going, whoa, wait, I want to be a part of this system or get in, well, you don't really have the networks or the connection or, right? And so people are just operating in a system. I don't always think, and this is where I think people get offended, right? That I don't make the natural assumption that a person is racist because they're operating in a system or they're working or using a system that could be racist, right? That could be exclusionary, right? I don't know that people are always fully aware and conscious of the fact that they're operating in a system and doing something that is leaving other people out, right? And that's where you start getting into the conversation of unconscious bias. Or, all of these things that, in our country, we're operating in ways and systems that were created that people are just doing, right? They're just doing it and they're having negative outcomes and impact, for certain groups of people. But do I necessarily think everybody who's operating in those systems are doing so with an awareness and consciousness that they're actually excluding people? I don't know that would be true.
Yeah. No,
and so that has been my experience when I was, in my job at A&F, right? What was happening when we got in there? Well, we recruit at this school. Okay, well, we recruit from this fraternity or sorority. So what was happening is everybody was going to the people that they knew, right? So, but if your circle is this small, then what are you going to do? You're going to get people that look just like you, think like you, act like you. It's going to be this vicious cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting to me too. And this is the part that, we're so passionate about emotional intelligence and, Toya, the role that I quite frankly think that EQ plays in supporting those change initiatives, because it's very clear that, between attention spans shrinking and I almost would say culturally, and I'm going to try to be tender here if I can. I think we've sort of allowed intellectual laziness to creep into how we operate.
Sure.
Okay. Because if you're a white executive and someone says, you really need to be focusing more on what's happening in the Hispanic community, that's going to require some work.
Yes.
Because you're going to see people that look different from you. They're going to behave different from you. I mean, fill the blank. And in all fairness, it could be you're a black executive. And they say, we need more people looking at the LGBTQ community.
That's right.
You're going to be confronted with something that's not going to be easy work.
Yeah.
And it used to be, I felt we were in a place where we wouldn't shy away from tough work.
Sure.
Yes. Because the reward for it is so profound, right? And one of the things that I love about the competencies around the emotional intelligence model we have is that it is the idea that is driving me as a human being to make better, more sound decisions.
Yes.
Because if we don't get out of this loop of laziness and, fill in the blank, I mean, we could add to the list, right? I think what we end up doing is, let's just hire somebody. Like you were describing, right? Okay, you're hired. You'll be the chief, whatever, and okay, and let me know. We'll meet once a month, and you tell me how it's going.
Yes.
And there's a press release, and okay, and then we're going to expect, as you described, you're going to expect that person with no support, financial, emotional, all this stuff, and then it fails.
Yes.
And I guess what I'm thinking in terms here is that the decision-making process for someone who is definitely committed to it, who's maybe they've had their heart broken, which I typically find is a key way to get somebody to move to change, is to get your heart broken. Yeah. Toya, if that person is that, right? I'm committed, Toya. I want to do something about it. What are some things you might, if you said, come here, I want to talk to you, Matt, one-on-one. Yeah. What would you tell them? What would you say? Hey, be prepared. Hey, here's something you need to consider. Be it large or small organization.
Yeah. I think you have to figure out your why of why you're doing this as an organization, right? So as we said, we talked about there were a lot of organizations that were rushing to say, hey, we're committed, to make a statement, right? But then once we get past all the noise, like all of the hype and all of, the expectations of companies to do this, why are you doing this? Are you really saying that we want to be an organization that is moving in this space, right? We understand the influence that we have at whatever organization that you are, right? You have a customer base, you have, people that connect to your brand. Like, we want to be an organization that is about purpose and about change. And I was doing some research and reading an article, and I will provide that for you all later.
Okay, great.
But where organizations are moving now in this space is around purpose. And they're connecting diversity, equity, and inclusion work around the purpose of an organization. And so for me, I think that's powerful. So an organization to say, we're not just about our shareholders, right? But we're about our stakeholders. And knowing who your stakeholders are, my customers. So for me, the way that I translate that in being, in a public school district, my stakeholders are my students, my teachers, and my principals, and my families, right? How am I serving them, right, and meeting their needs? And so I think an organization can do the same thing. Is where do we want to be in this space? How do we want to be transformative? How do we want to be a part of this? How do we recognize who our customers are, our stakeholders, and be able to speak to them in a way that is meaningful? So I would say figure out your purpose, the why of why do you want to do this? Of course, we know that it makes business sense. We look at companies that, have diversity. They tend to be who have diverse staff or diverse board members or diverse, executives. They tend to be the more successful companies. So there's data out there that supports that. Those are a couple of reasons why I think it's a good thing to do. If you want to be profitable, I think of it this way. When I invite more people at the table, right, people who think differently than I do, who have different skill sets than I have, and I can create an environment where I can pull the best out of those people, that puts me in a situation where I'm like, getting the best out of people and putting us in the best situation. So why would I want to limit that? Why would I want to limit that potential, that diversity of thought, perspective, experience, lived experiences that people have? I want that, right?
And
because if you're thinking of of an organization, your for-profit organization, why would you not want to be able to capitalize on market share? I don't know. It seems pretty simple to me, but I mean, there are real challenges that people have, right?
Absolutely.
People want to be comfortable, right? We like comfort. We like predictability, right? We like that, it takes time. Yeah. When you bring more people at the table and you invite more thought, that takes more time.
And you know what, Toya? We've talked about this on other shows, this idea about these neural pathways that we all have developed. Mm-hmm. And use the analogy of the road. Some of them are as simple as a residential street and a subdivision. Mm-hmm. Some of them are as complex as a freeway system. And we started this when we were children.
Yes.
And some of this is rooted around the idea of how do I survive, how do I navigate, whether it was a good family situation or a bad family situation, good school, bad school, whatever. And those things get developed. And our brains are so, oh my gosh, the miracle of us as human beings, because it's designed to protect us, to give us order, to give us, direction, all of that. Yes. But then change comes. Mm-hmm. Some of that change, as we all know, is forced change. Mm-hmm. We've all experienced it. Some of it is change by choice. Hey, I'm not going to live here. I'm going to live there. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to work there. I'm going to work here. And our brains are going to resist at the beginning. Mm-hmm. Our brains are going to say, what are you doing? No. What? We always work here. That's that's the road we take. That's the cafeteria we eat in, or whatever the case may be. So I think what happens, and I don't think organizations are too far off from this, they hit that initial resistance, and then they think about, like you mentioned, comfort. Well, we weren't really that bad, Toya. I mean, we did some things last year. Let's just, right? Mm-hmm. The high-performing companies, I would say the more highly emotionally intelligent companies, are saying this is just part of the process. There is going to be the resistance, but we have to keep it, and we have to keep going. Because whether they know this consciously or not, eventually your brain begins to follow your change.
Exactly.
Because of that neuroplasticity that we all have, right? Where all of a sudden it was resisting you, now all of us saying, well, of course we want to change. Of course it's important. Of course we want to have more market share. Yeah. But man, is it crucial in that beginning framework, right?
Yes.
And you've seen it. I mean, it's not just rooted only around DEI. It's this experience that we're in. And I'm saying all of that to say, those of you in the audience, just don't give up.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable. It is, so I've been working with one of our buildings. And the staff wanted me to come in to do some training with them, along with my colleague who leads our professional training. Mm-hmm. And it was rough, right? Some of these conversations that we had, and, when people feel vulnerable, feel safe, right? To really express where they might be struggling around this idea of diversity and inclusion or bias, right? That doesn't feel good. And the whole way along, I kept saying to the staff, it's okay. This is a part of it. This is going to feel uncomfortable. It's going to feel scary. It might feel unsafe. You have to get through that in order for us to get on the other side of it. And I kept encouraging, we're all right. I promise you. I'm right here next to you. Right? I'm right here next with you, And so, and every time I went with them and we had a conversation, we had a session, I was energized and I was encouraged after each one of those, because they went through this struggle together as a staff to say, wow, this was uncomfortable. This was scary. But I think we grew in trust with each other.
Yeah.
We grew in familiarity with each other. We grew comfortable with each other, right? And those are things that's when you want to have that, when you have an inclusive environment, right? And you can pull on all of those things to get the best out of your employees.
Yeah. I'm going to touch on another thing around the idea of unconscious bias, and then I want to hear about some of the exciting things you're working on and into. So I heard this from a gentleman. I think I'm going to get his name right. I think it's Paul David Tripp, and he's a different kind of cat. And I love him for it, probably because of my different kind of cat mentality. But he's given this talk, and he says we need to be having these more one-way conversations with ourselves. We need to talk to ourselves more. Now, you can look around the audience and go, or you know, and then he kind of does the tongue-in-cheek. The only problem is if you're talking back. I mean, if you're having two-way conversations, then there might be an issue. But he said that we don't wrestle with our thoughts and our emotions. We don't have those self-conversations. And I go back to that interview with LeVar Arrington. It's 2:30 in the morning, and I'm going, okay, wait a minute, Eric. What were you just dismissing that? And you go, well, maybe I am. Maybe I'm in that process of where I've heard it so much that I'm kind of like wanting to say that it's not so because it's so worn out. And I'm so thankful for that self-conversation because it kind of moved me to a place that I may not have been before. And I think that's that idea of if you want to get out of unconscious bias, and I'm not saying this is a silver bullet and if you do it tomorrow it'll work. Right. But maybe we should go, well, wait a minute. I say that I'm not. I say I'm not that. Well, am I? But what are my actions? What did my calendar reveal? What was I doing 6 months ago? Maybe 5 years ago? Are we willing to evaluate ourselves? Not to judge. This is not about, hey, you're a bad person. See, now it proves that you're a bad person.
Right.
This is about finding those things that might be hiding underneath the surface that have autonomy over you, and you don't even really know it.
I agree.
Right?
Yes.
So to your point, and then I want to pivot because I want to hear more about what you're working on. Is there where's a place that people can go? And I don't know, maybe it's an accountability group. Maybe it's fellow DEI executives or people who, whatever you want to use as the descriptor. Because I got to imagine a lot of these organizations, people are hitting the wall pretty hard. I mean, the resistance. Is there a place for them to go?
A place. That's a great question. You know, I mean, there's tons of podcasts out there. I mean, clearly, I'm on one of them right now.
Yes, and we're happy about that.
But honestly, there are tons of them out there, and I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah,
I highly encourage people to be self-reflective, right? If you can have the courage to say, where am I in this space? Am I unknowingly doing something where I might be contributing to something?
Yep.
And I think people, you know what I think people are the most afraid of, and I will say white people are the most afraid of, is being called a racist. I think that is just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Right? Like that is so, and I think for me, I think very few people, I mean, there are clearly people out there who we could easily identify that. But I think very few people knowingly, intentionally, consciously are racist. Yeah. Meaning that they are out here really trying to put someone down. And so I think sometimes that word, calling people that and identifying that can be a barrier for people.
Yeah.
I tend to say that people really are operating in a place of unconscious bias. Yep. That we do have biases, we do have stereotypes that we operate off of that that motivate our behavior.
Yep.
And I think when they're brought to our attention, most people, right? It has been my experience that most people are like, "Oh my gosh, I did not know that."
I would agree with that.
I am so sorry. I did not realize I was doing that, or I did not realize that my behavior had this impact on you.
And Toya, I know you well enough to know that, and I am in your tribe. This is not to say that if you experience something horrifying from someone who is in that category is a racist, that it diminishes that trauma, that event at all.
No,
it's just we're talking about from the experience on the whole. I sometimes think when we get into this arena of where we're really trying to find solutions, if we're really committed to trying to move the needle from where it was to where we aspire to be, right? It does matter how we position the conversation, right? I've always been of the mind that, and again, I'm one of the crazy ones, and probably our audience would say, yes, he is one of the crazy ones. I welcome those conversations with someone who is maybe in that category of, yeah, I do think that your people are the problem, because I want to understand that.
Yes.
I want them to explain it. Where did that come from?
Yes.
When did you come to that conclusion that because of skin pigment, it means this?
Right.
Because oftentimes I think, Toya, and this is not just in race and diversity, we've got that psychological issue that has been unattended to. And a big part of the reason why it has been unattended to is because America has stigmatized mental health to a level that, let's say you are a devout racist, and you get the conclusion after talking with a dear friend that, man, there's a problem here, and it's much deeper than just your dislike of that group. Is that person going to say, well, hey, wow, I'm so grateful for you to say that. Where can I find someone to get some counseling?
Right.
Most of the time, it's like, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm fine. I'll work on this.
Yeah.
I've seen that so often in other places. So for me, I look at it and go, there's something deeper happening here, because again, my experience to what you said, your experience, in most situations, people don't necessarily want that.
Yeah.
So
for me, I say it's work. It's soul work. It's heart work.
Yeah.
Right? So I am trying. The organization can't change unless, because the organization is a collection of people, right? A group of people. So we speak of organizations as though they're this thing, but they're a thing that's made up of people.
Yep.
Right? And so for me, I speak of it in terms of where is your heart? Where are you? And what can you change? And are you open to that? Are you curious about other people and their lived experiences, right? That are different than yours. Do you have empathy around that? Can you, even though you've not lived it, can you understand what an experience may be like from a person who is coming to this country, have no knowledge of anything about this country, doesn't speak the language, right? Do you have a heart? Does that tug at your heart a little bit, even though that's not your lived experience? And could you understand why they might find challenge in navigating in an organization or in a school district or something? Do you feel that? And
you know what,
at
Toya, when you say that, I'm thinking, and that person, if we'd only realized, do you realize how much more rich your life could be by getting the experience of another human being who maybe it's the saddest irony. Yeah. It's like we pick and choose. I don't want to talk to them. I don't want to talk to them. They look like that. They're from that. I don't need that. Wonderful example for me from a health perspective. I discovered maybe 10 years ago, I had arthritis in my lower left back because I went to the doctor and it was like, I can't, I mean, it won't go away. Yeah. Does the x-ray and says, you've got arthritis in your lower left. And he was a general practitioner. So he was kind of like, you can do Motrin or you can put ice, whatever. I had a friend that said, you should really look at yoga. Yoga could potentially be something for you. Yeah. And he knew me pretty well. And he was kind of like, and it might even be something you'd really get into. Yeah. And as most people know, yoga's origins, it's India, South Asia.
Yes.
And I started looking into it, and I started doing it, and oh my gosh, there's not many things that I have embraced in the form of physical that have, I would say, it fixed me.
Wow.
I have no lower left back pain.
Wow.
Now, you could say, but Eric, that's just exercise. Is it really? Mm-hmm. Or is it me being open and curious, you said, to explore something that, I mean, I tell you, when I first started, it would have made a funny video. Trying to hold those poses and keep my balance, and falling all over the place. Sure. But look at the result. And I guess I'm saying it this way for the audience is that maybe that's where your organization, or maybe that's where you're at personally, where it's like trying to hold a pose and you're falling over and you look silly and you look like you don't know what you're doing. But you know what? Though I am not going to be on a television show of the perfect, I'm not a yogi, right? But there's a lot of movements that I couldn't do 5 years ago that I do now rather effortlessly. Yes. And it was because I was willing to work at it. Anyway, I want to get to something else. Okay. What are you excited about? What's inspiring you lately? What's going on in your world?
Well, in my world, I'm in a new role, right? I'm in a new role. I'm in a new industry, if you will.
Yes, you are in a different world because so much of your past career was more of the corporate type deal, and education is such a different.
Yes.
So how are you doing? I should ask you that.
I mean, they took a shot on somebody who didn't know anything about education and
but
knew the work. I mean, so it's been great, right? Okay. So this is the first time I'm in the number one seat. Okay. So I was always very comfortable being in the number two seat. I always said, and my mentor will say this,
right?
He would say to me, he would encourage me to apply for, I'm like, nope, I have no interest in being in a number one seat, leading this work in any organization.
Right.
And so I find myself in this space many, many years later. And so it's been refreshing. It's been fun. It's been challenging. It's been emotional. All of those things that for me, I would say, make it great work. Because it's not easy. Yeah. It's not supposed to be easy, right? When you're changing hearts and minds, when you're, disrupting people's, thought processes around things, and not in a negative way. I mean, I went into a great situation. When you look in the way of, where people are when they say they want initiative, Worthington has been doing work. Right?
Yes,
they have people in place that were, core committee of folks who were doing things. We have a board of education who's on board. They came out with a statement, against anti-racism, yes, saying that we want to be an anti-racist school district. Right. We're supporting social justice. I mean, when you look at, you're walking in, people are saying they're committed. Next up, they're doing the work. So that's been great. I have, support of many, many people, my colleagues, community's been embracing.
So I gotta ask you within the community aspect, Worthington is a suburb.
Yes.
Right. So if you had to break down the percentage of say, white, African American, Indian, Hispanic, what's that look like?
In Worthington per se, it's very white. It's probably about at least 90% white. Okay. So when you look at the community itself, the majority is a white, community. When you look at the school district by comparison, though, our population of color is around 32%.
Interesting.
So much of our school district, 2/3 of it are Columbus City or Columbus students. Only 1/3 of it is Worthington student population. So our community our school district is not necessarily reflective of Worthington, Ohio residential population.
Gotcha.
And so that's where it becomes very real for our school district, right? Because when we look at our, EL population, for example, or we look at our racial ethnic population, it's very different. Yeah. And so how do we then as a school district are responsive to that? Because it has shifted over the years, right? The demographic makeup of what our student population looks like has changed.
Gotcha. Wow.
So, but I have been, Eric, for me, being new to the community as well. I did not grow up in Worthington, nor did I go through Worthington Schools. the first thing for me is establishing relationships, is building relationships. What I know as a diversity person, I don't go out. The diversity person does not go out and hire anybody. We don't, I'm not in front of students, or when I worked at A&F, I wasn't in a store. Right. So I'm not interacting with our customers, in that way, or I'm not directly interacting with our students in that way.
Yep.
So what I have to do is I have to be able to work through people. Right. I have to be able to bring people along with me in this journey and influence behavior. Right. Get people to understand what it is that, we're trying to do in Worthington Schools. Connect with me. Trust me. Right. Because if people don't trust me, if they're not comfortable with me, if they're not safe with me, there's no way I can be able to challenge the organization or challenge people to say, hey, let's start doing that heart work. Let's start looking at, do we have processes in place that are inequitable? Right? Do we have things systemically that are producing negative outcomes? Right? So everything that I've been doing right now is building relationships with people, getting to know the community, allowing people to know me, listening to people who are on both sides of it, who are all in, with this diversity, equity, inclusion work, and who might be like, I'm not sure about this.
Yeah.
Talk to me too.
Yep.
Help me to understand where you might be struggling. Where's the entry point for you in this conversation, right?
Yeah.
So,
that's awesome.
That, and then I have been working to establish a common language and understanding around this work. So what does diversity, equity, inclusion mean? What does implicit bias mean? What role do I want you to play? As a teacher, as an administrator, what do I want you to do? How do I want you to talk about it?
Wow.
So we've been doing our impact of implicit bias training. I've been co-facilitating that class. And then finally, I'm working on an equity audit, which we talked about the systemic and institutional things. We're going to actually take a audit, go through a 4-hour process where we're going to answer questions that will evaluate us as a school district in terms of how we are from a financial perspective, resource perspective, pedagogy and curriculum, people perspective, HR processes. And then at the end of that, we'll get a report that kind of tells us where we are and some recommendations, and that will inform my strategic plan on how we're going to do this work in Worthington Schools.
Wow. So would you come back and give us an update?
Sure.
And we'll probably have other things to talk about as well, Toya.
Absolutely.
I've enjoyed this so much with you. And one last thing I'm going to touch on, because I know we're running close here on time. You mentioned about feeling safe, right?
Yes.
I hear you in that. I feel that, because at Spirit of EQ, we try to help people understand this is an area where you can feel safe. And some people I know kind of consider that kind of light and feathery, but it's really very heavy. It's a very important thing. We're talking about the kind of safety in our world is that, if I run into something that makes me a little uncomfortable, I don't have to look over my shoulder to see if someone might have heard or seen. I can look at it and I can be curious. I can go at it from a different angle. I can ask them maybe a little difficult question or two. Because when people don't feel safe, and I'm speaking from my own experience, what I did is I checked out.
Yes.
I had my 3 or 4 walls. And yes, in the meeting, I would acknowledge, yes. And if they needed me to, sure. But all I was thinking in my head is, when are we leaving? When is this over?
Yeah.
A decision I made, my process, but I got to believe I'm not alone. So I applaud you in that there's that striving that people, they need to have a safe place where they can go and be. It's just really important.
And it's on both ends, right? So I want to be clear in saying that for the person who may be on the end of experiencing racism or experiencing exclusion, they need to be in a safe environment to be able to say that as well.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
And not fearing that there's going to be some retaliation or there's going to be something that, because I do bring this to your attention about where you've caused harm, that I'm not safe to be able to say that. So for me, safety on both sides is important for us to get to common understanding of each other. So
it's great. Toya, once again, thank you for thank you for being on the show. We really appreciate it. We enjoyed this.
Me.
Audience, as always, there'll be show notes, so there's a lot of information further, and we do appreciate you tuning in. Hi, everyone. This is Eric Pennington with The Spirit of EQ. I'm not introducing a new episode today. I'm here to tell you some things that might help you. Jeff, you're with me as always, so
yes.
How do people get in touch with us?
Well, the best way is just send us an email at info@spiritofeq.com.
That's awesome. Jeff, I was also thinking about reviews, and I'm notoriously bad at asking for them, so reviews on all of the platforms wherever you get your podcasts.
Yes.
Do you think that'd be good?
I think that would be great because, one, that will help us learn how to make better ones, and it's always good for us.
So we're not the perfect podcast host?
We're close.
Okay, all right, but
not,
still,
not totally
we want
perfect.
your feedback. We want your feedback.
But it also might let us know a new subject. Hey, we need to dig deeper into that.
Yeah.
So let us know what you think.
Cool. We really appreciate that. As always, too, there is social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, and we also have a YouTube channel. Those also have mechanisms or options for you to be able to leave a comment, a like, or those kind of things. Just want to make sure that you know how to get in touch with us. Right, Jeff?
Right. We appreciate you all.
Thank you.